Pink Floyd is known as one of the most important and successful bands in the history of music, and a really big part of that success is thanks to their 1973 release, The Dark Side of the Moon. The legacy of the album often speaks for itself, being one of the most influential albums of all time, selling over 40 million copies, making it one of the best-selling albums ever, having an instantly recognizable album cover, and being incredibly important for the progressive rock genre. However, the legacy of Dark Side of the Moon goes far beyond. In the eyes of a lot of people, this is the first concept album ever made. This is the first progressive rock album ever made. This is the greatest album by Pink Floyd and even of all time. And that is exactly what I want to talk to you guys about in this video. Before I say anything, I want to make sure you guys know that I love Dark Side of the Moon. In my opinion, this is one of the most well put together and cohesive albums from the progressive rock genre and the entirety of Pink Floyd's discography. In my opinion, if you want to get into the progressive rock genre but feel a little intimidated by those 20-minute plus songs that you'll find often in these albums, Dark Side of the Moon is a really good starting point for you because it doesn't really have those long-winded instrumentations. All the songs are kind of direct and to the point, and that's going to be a really good way for you to get used to the sort of sound that you'll find all across this genre. And overall, songs like Brain Damage, Breathe, Us and Them, Money, and Time are some of the best songs the band has to offer. So why is it that I find the legacy of the album to be so confusing? Here's the thing, in the music world, every now and then an album is released that's loved and praised by everybody. The White Album by the Beatles, Electric Ladyland, Jimi Hendrix, The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust by David Bowie, The Velvet Underground and Nico by The Velvet Underground, Highway 61 Revisited by Bob Dylan, Led Zeppelin 4 by Led Zeppelin, and the list goes on. Every time that an album receives such a level of praise, it falls in the category of one of the greatest albums of all time. So when you find people talking about these albums, you'll often hear them say, Led Zeppelin 4, one of the greatest albums of all time, Revolver, one of the greatest albums of all time. But something you won't hear that often is an album being called the greatest of all time. Actually, there's only two records that get that honor kind of often, and that is Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band by the Beatles and Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd. Now, I've talked about Sgt. Pepper's quite often on this channel, and if you've seen any of my other videos, you know that I don't agree with anyone who says that Sgt. Pepper's is the greatest achievement in music history. But I agree even less with anyone who says that the Dark Side of the Moon is deserving of that title. First of all, I don't think any album should be called the greatest achievement ever. In my opinion, the greatest piece of music ever made is the White Album by the Beatles, released in 1968. But if someone comes to me and asks, what is the greatest achievement in the history of music, I definitely wouldn't say the White Album. I would have no idea, because I don't think that such a thing exists. Albums are really personal. Music is a form of art, and people enjoy art in different ways. So there's no way that you can find an album where everyone agrees is the greatest thing ever made. It's just not possible. However, people saying The Dark Side of the Moon is the greatest album of all time is not really the reason why I'm making this video. Everyone is entitled to their own opinion, but there's other things being said about the album that in my opinion make no sense. For example, there's a lot of people who believe that Dark Side of the Moon was the first concept album ever made. You don't really need to know all that much about music to know that this is simply not true. I mean, concept albums go back to the 50s with Frank Sinatra's In the Wee Small Hours. I know that a lot of people seem to believe that concept albums are based on narrative, or that you need to have a coherent narrative throughout the track list to make a concept album, but that's not really how it works. I mean, a concept album is basically a record that follows a certain mood or a certain feeling throughout the entire track list. So even an album that's not connected through the narrative of the songs can still be a concept album, as proven with multiple jazz albums released in the 60s and even the 50s, if you want to count Miles Davis's Kind of Blue. But even if you don't want to count those albums, if you don't want to admit the fact that Frank Sinatra made a concept album with In the Wee Small Hours and Songs for the Swingin' Lovers, then you can go into the 60s and find multiple other examples, like Sgt. Pepper's, for example, Pet Sounds, Rubber Soul, and even in the 70s, a year before Pink Floyd released Dark Side of the Moon, you'd have David Bowie's The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust. So the idea that The Dark Side of the Moon was the first concept album ever made is just simply not true. But this is not the only thing being said about The Dark Side of the Moon that kind of confuses me, because there's also a huge amount of people that seem to believe that The Dark Side of the Moon was the first progressive rock album ever made, or at least the birth of the genre. And this is once again simply not true. I don't even need to leave the band's discography to find another incredible piece of progressive rock music and metal. There's also a bunch of albums in the 60s that could be called progressive rock music, or at least an early version of progressive rock music. For example, Frank Zappa with Freak Out, released in 1966. And I know that some of you will probably go ahead and listen to that album for the first time and are going to think that this is not progressive rock music, but for me, this is the earliest example of the genre taking shape. Then you have what, in my opinion, is the actual birth of the genre, Moody Blues with Days of Future Past, released in 1967, and then obviously one of the greatest albums ever made, 1969, In the Court of the Crimson King, in my opinion, the best progressive rock album ever made. And I can name probably more than 20 other albums that fit into the progressive rock sound that came before Dark Side of the Moon, and once again, even inside the band's discography, you have progressive rock before the Dark Side of the Moon. I don't really know why anyone would call the Dark Side of the Moon the first progressive rock album ever made. It's just simply not true. Now, there's one more thing that people say about this album that I personally think it's highly debatable, and it's the fact that people seem to believe that this is the most influential album ever made. There's a shit ton of people saying this all over the place. I mean, you'll even find articles written by professional journalists talking about the massive influence this album had. But me personally, after studying so much music and after listening to so many albums, I don't see the massive influence a lot of people seem to find in the sound of this album. For me, Piper at the Gates of Dawn, Animals, and The Wall are way more influential in terms of sound, texture, concept, including politics and music, including large instrumental pieces that go from one phase to the other in a way that's so slow and so perfectly put together that you barely even notice. There's so much perfection in those late 70s Pink Floyd albums that I don't know how anyone can look at Dark Side of the Moon and believe that's the best album by the band, honestly. But let's stay on topic. Comparing the influence of Dark Side of the Moon to that of an album like The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust by David Bowie, the beginning of glam rock music, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, one of the first concept albums ever made, and an incredible change in the sound of the Beatles, the first time that artists were allowed to be different and still be successful. The Velvet Underground and Nico, the first proto-punk album ever made, and the beginning of indie music as we know it. Bringing It All Back Home and Highway 61 Revisited by Bob Dylan, pretty much the first folk rock albums, and a complete change in the way that people performed in the folk scene and later on in every other genre of music. Patti Smith's Horses and Iggy and the Stooges with Raw Power, some of the most essential albums from the punk genre. There's so many other records released in the 60s and the 70s that were so much more important for the development of music in the 80s, 90s, and even now in the 2020s that I don't really see how anyone can look at Dark Side of the Moon and say, yeah, that's the most influential album of all time, just because of the level of popularity the album enjoyed. Because that's the running argument for a lot of people. A lot of people seem to believe that just because the album sold millions and millions and millions, and it's gotten to the point where it sold more than 40 millions now, that automatically makes it more influential just because of the amount of people that heard the album. But I don't really think that's how it works. There's multiple other albums even inside the band's discography that offered a different sound, offered the base of a sound for other artists to develop it in future albums. So for that reason, I disagree with anyone who says that The Dark Side of the Moon is the most influential album ever. And listen, I know I've been a little harsh. I know that a lot of you are simply going to think that I don't like the album, but that's not true. In my opinion, this is one of the best, most enjoyable, and most accessible progressive rock albums ever made. But when you call this the greatest piece of music ever released, especially if you're talking to someone that doesn't know that much about music, I don't think you're doing the rest of the music world justice. There's so many incredible, groundbreaking, unique, and special albums out there that taking this one album and calling it the greatest thing ever just because of how popular it was and because the album cover is really pretty feels like a massive misrepresentation of what music actually has to offer. So even though I love this album, even though I adore everything it stands for, I love every single song, and I do believe that it's an incredible achievement for the band and for progressive rock music overall, I think that the legacy of the album is blown out of proportion, and I do believe that this album is massively overrated. That is going to be it for today's video. I know that a lot of you guys will disagree with me, so please remember, this is only my personal opinion. I know that a lot of you will disagree, and that's part of the reason why I make this video, so I want to see if anyone in the comments can say something that's going to change my mind. Remember, I love this album. I don't think it's a bad record. I do believe that it deserves to be called one of the greatest progressive rock albums of all time, but the greatest album overall of all time, I don't really think so. So leave me your opinion down below in the comments. I really do hope that you enjoyed this video as much as I enjoyed making it. If you did, go ahead and leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any other videos that I upload. If you want me to talk about any other topics related to music, if you want me to check out a song, an album, or an artist, leave it down below as well, and I'll make sure to read it and fulfill your request as soon as I can. I really do hope I can see you guys soon with another video, but until then, bye.